What's really interesting about this is they've gone for more and more and more power. It makes 190 horsepower now, so it's 10 horsepower up on the previous 1290 version. As you can imagine, they've done that by giving it a bigger engine, hence the name. Actually, only 49cc bigger, not 100, but still, it's bigger. And also, it's got variable valve lift, I believe. It's got some kind of like shift cam type thing. But it was a couple of years ago, the reason that they say they don't have a large capacity sports bike is because the kind of CEO of the Piera Mobility Group that owns KTM said that if your bikes are getting towards 200 horsepower, they don't belong on the street. There's no way you can use all that. And basically, bikes of that power only belong on the track. And yet now they've got a 190 horsepower naked, and so it's a bit like, well, does he mean there's a hard cut off at 200 horsepower?
Literally,
where he finds it acceptable.
201 is too much.
Where's the sweet spot, mate? What's too much and what's fine in your books? If his is 200, let's assume that's what he means.
I'd need to think what the most powerful thing I've sat on is. The Panigale V4's got to be up there if it isn't the most powerful thing I've sat on.
It must be.
So
it must be.
From our day of taking them out, I can't say it felt like too much, but then that's because I went in with an element of reserve on my right hand and I didn't just completely grip it and flip the bike. So it depends how it's handled. It depends how it's delivered. What I would say about when you get to that really, really high standard of horsepower, it makes you want to use it, basically. That's the biggest risk, is that it's pointless because, if the speed limit's 70, you won't even have to try to get to lose your license speed. So, I don't know, mate. Basically, any bike I've ever had, and I'm sure you're the same, you'd be like, oh yeah, this is great. The first time you take it out, you're like, this is all I need for power. Why would anyone need anything more? And then you own it for like a week or something. Maybe it's even just in that day. By the end of the day, you're kind of like, yeah, I could take a bit more. When you get up to 200, I think he's got an argument there. I think 160, MT10 is like 160, and that felt about as fast as you would ever need from a bike. So probably 150, 160 is kind of the sweet spot for me.
The sweet spot where you can use it all.
You still can't use it all, but basically yes.
Yeah, that Panigale V4 I think is the most powerful bike I've ridden as well. We were out there on a Ducati media day. I think it was interesting that both of us actually probably preferred we were swapping between the Panigale V4 and V2, weren't we? Back and forth. And I think both of us actually preferred the slightly smaller bike, and also because you're not using that extra 50 horsepower or so, it didn't really make any difference to me.
It's I've just looked it up actually. So the Panigale V4, I believe, is about 210, 211 ish, around that. It's over 200, so it's over his threshold for this should be on a track. And I would say he's probably right, because the thing is, you hear this from people who do race, from people who really genuinely do know, as opposed to two idiots. That they'll prefer something like a 600 to 1000cc because they can use all of it.
You've said what the most powerful bike you've ridden is, though, but like, what's the most enjoyable? Like, if you can think of everything that we've reviewed and stuff, like, really the question is, you said where the sweet spot is, but I don't know if it is around that point. Like, is there a bike that you can remember where you're like, I'm just having the most fun on this? It could be one that you owned as well.
In recent memory, some of the days that I've enjoyed most, but it could be just the full conditions of it. I think everything goes into it. It's riding the right bike on the right road. So if you have a sports bike and you're on a track, it'll feel really exciting. But if you're on some B roads, you probably want something a bit smaller. And as weird as it's going to sound, but one of my favourite bikes or experiences recently was the CF Moto little sports bike there. I think it was a 300. It can't have been more than a 400. And we took that over the roads in Spain, which were absolutely back-to-back switchbacks, which you know all too well. And of the bikes that I tried on that day, that was one of my favourites because you could absolutely full throttle the thing on almost every corner. And you could have a great time with it. So that's got to be like 40 horsepower or something. It's something smaller than that, but real small capacity. But it's more about, is the bike appropriate for the conditions? I guess it loops back to his theory, over 200 horsepower, track ready bike. But under that, then you can still use it on the road. So that was one of them. For another one for me, the V7 was just really satisfying for me because it felt like you were really engaged in what the bike was doing. Like I had a street triple, but it felt like the bike was making me look good. Whereas with the V7, if I was riding well, I could take full satisfaction that I was a part of that system. So,
despite the bike, you were still going at a decent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I often do the run to Silverstone and back because there's lots of motorcycle manufacturers there. And I go the same route through the Cotswolds, and it's not necessarily like the best roads and the best surfaces, but it's just a bit of everything. You know, there's some tight turns, there's some longer ones, there's some slow bits, there's some quicker open bits, there's some single lane almost with a bit of like wet road and gravel and bumpy bits. Then there's some nice smooth bits, and it's good, you know, a couple of hours each way. So you get a bit of an idea of comfort levels as well. That's really interesting, doing that a lot, picking different bikes up, because it's almost like it's the closest I can get to like a controlled test. Obviously the weather might differ, the traffic, but there's a bit of motorway at the end as well. And I just always think like the best rides, like sometimes I've got that crummy old SV650S that I use to drop off there and leave it in a garage with one of the manufacturers whilst I bring one of their bikes back and borrow it. And the rides there on a simple bike like that with a sporty position, 70 horsepower-ish, are really fun, because exactly like you say with the V7, if you're going quick, then you feel like it's more down to you. And also the feeling of like having it wide open is fun as well. And you don't get that experience so much on the quicker bikes. All right, so we're saying between 40 and 70 horsepower.
Yeah. To be honest, for what
I don't think many people would agree with that.
I'd say, to be honest, I mean, what's mine? Like 94 on the Africa Twin. It is context dependent, right? Because mine's a heavier bike, so that needs 100 horsepower to make it fun. If it was 70 horsepower on that bike, it'd feel a little bit sluggish. So
funny though, actually, my Tiger 800 is the other bike that I do that run on quite a lot.
Yeah.
And more often on that, I feel a bit dissatisfied. It just needs another 10 or 20. It's like you say, heavier. It's got all the cases on. It's not as aerodynamic, I guess. And yeah, that makes about 90. And sometimes I just think like I've got it wide open and it's just not as quick as I'd expect. Maybe that's why they made the new Tiger 900, 110 horsepower-ish. Something around that area, isn't it? That actually sounds quite good. All right, well, yeah, okay. Context is the ultimate conclusion there. Thank you, Tim. It depends on the road, depends on the bike, depends on how you feel that day.
Yeah.